Here we go. Here's our video review for topic 0.4 and 0.5. It's going to focus mostly on the Civil War. Alright, coming up here in 1849, we've got 15 slave states, 15 free states. That's going to be a balance of power issue that we're eventually going to have to deal with. The free states are going to want to have more power in Congress to make laws and that sort of thing. Same thing with the slave states. Any upset in the balance of power is going to give whichever side gets more states, either slave or free, a bit of an edge. So, after the Mexican-American War, we get all that land in the Mexican cession. California is going to want to come into the United States. That's going to threaten to upset that balance of power. It's going to be a big decision. How do we handle this? Well, Henry Clay comes up with the Compromise of 1850, and that's going to allow California to come in as a free state. And as a result, however, the Fugitive Slave Act is going to be passed. The second one, not the original one, 1793. This is going to do what you can see up on the screen right here a little bit. The Fugitive Slave Act in this case is going to be much more strict than the original. It's going to now be a requirement, a law, that you go ahead and return any runaway slaves. It's going to give people up north the power, or from down south, to go and get those slaves. It's going to give people the power to go and take freedmen from the north and take them back down south and sell them into slavery. So that's going to really upset the northerners, and that's going to increase tensions prior to the Civil War. Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. We talked about in class how selling 1 million copies and 300,000 the first year is really, really big, because a lot of people couldn't necessarily read at that time. Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to increase slavery. It's going to paint a really negative picture of slavery. So Northerners are going to, in general, become incensed and very much against slavery, more so than ever before, because Uncle Tom is going to be shown to be suffering throughout slavery. Southerners aren't going to like it because it's going to depict them in a very negative light. Popular sovereignty, let's talk about that for just a second here. Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. Kansas and Nebraska are two territories. They want to go ahead and come into the Union like California did. How do they figure all this out? They're not going to be able to do a deal quite like they did with California, so they say, let's let popular sovereignty. The people get to decide. The people are going to vote. The result of this is going to be Bleeding Kansas in 1856. You're going to have Free Soilers, anti-slavery political party, and the Border Ruffians, pro-slavery people. They're going to come into Kansas from all over. They're going to set up their own governments, pro-slavery governments. We're going to have pro-abolition governments, and neither side is really going to be able to gain much of an edge. There's going to be a lot of fighting because the tensions are going to be through the roof. And so that's going to be what's going on here with Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas. A lot of tension, a lot of nastiness. It's going to boil over, and our boy John Brown is going to get involved as well. We'll talk more about him here in just a second. First, though, the Republicans, as we know them today, are going to form in 1854. The Whig Party, W-H-I-G, they could not figure out how they felt on slavery, so they kind of dissolved. What forms out of that is the Republican Party in 1854. Dred Scott versus Sanford, it's in 1857. The basics of it, the key to really know about this. It says that African Americans are not citizens. We already kind of knew that based on the Three-Fifths Compromise and all that sort of stuff that we talked about previously, but this reasserts that in an official Supreme Court decision. What happens? Dred Scott, his master, he's a slave. Dred Scott's master takes him from the South to a northern state where slavery is illegal and frowned upon. Dred Scott then says, hey, I should be a free man. He ends up suing because, of course, his master says no. With that in mind, the court is going to sit there and say, no, dude, look, basically you're a piece of property. You're no more valuable, than the dirt on the ground. An animal, you're a piece of equipment, if you will, for your master to use. You have no rights. You technically can't even sue. So Dred Scott's going to be turned down and turned away. This is a big win for slave owners. It reasserts their dominance and authority over the slaves. There's our funny little Dred Scott guy. Ha ha. We've got the caning of Charles Sumner here. Sumner's on the bottom there, getting caned by Preston Brooks. Sumner's from Massachusetts, Brooks from South Carolina. Talked briefly about this. This highlights the increasing tensions. It's spilling over into the political world, the violence that's coming from this. Any attacks upon slavery are going to be seen very negatively by the South, to the point where they're going to get to the point of defending this via violence. And so that's caning of Sumner right there. John Brown, an abolitionist. Mentioned him in Bleeding, Kansas. He does a little bit of raiding there. Is involved in some murders at Pottawatomie Creek. A couple years later, he has this plan to free the slaves. So he raids Harper's Ferry, which is an arsenal. It is a military depot that's going to house a lot of weapons. And his goal is to start a slave rebellion. The idea being that, hey, I'll start it and the slaves will flock to me and they'll come from all over and they'll try and revolt. Never happened. The military comes and surrounds John Brown, his sons, brothers, family, friends, all that are involved. Captures him, kill a few others. I believe he's injured during the fight. No slaves come, in part because they've never had this sort of opportunity before. It's not ingrained in their blood, like we talked about the women's rights movement, with women sometimes being against the women's rights movement. Same concept here. Most slaves at this point, that's all they've ever known is slavery. They've known that to raise a hand against their masters, to cause harm to white people, is going to end badly for them. Mutilation, torture, death, whipping, you name it, they're all on the board. So they're going to be scared off from that. They don't think they have the right. In addition, some of them are simply afraid. They don't want to end up going the way John Brown will eventually be and be killed. So Brown gets captured, hanged for treason. The thing about this, though, the really key to know about John Brown here, the North is going to see him as a bit of a martyr, someone that has died for a noble cause. And John Brown's okay with this. He kind of feels like, hey, if I've got to give my life so that people in slavery can be free, then so be it. That's what I need to do, and I'm comfortable with that. In the South, this is kind of almost the final nail in the coffin. It'll be Lincoln's election in 1860 that really kicks it off. But this solidifies the viewpoints of Northerners and Southerners. Southerners are going to view the Northerners in a very, very negative light. At this point, they're going to see most all Northerners and abolitionists as John Brown. John Brown, he's coming for our slaves. We're not going to be able to stop him no matter what they say. Even if they say they're not coming for our slaves and our way of life, they're going to do it anyways. They're a bunch of crazy type of people, just like John Brown was. So as far as attitudes and mindset go, this really drives the nail in the coffin for how Southerners and Northerners are generally going to view each other. 1860 comes around, got to elect somebody. The Democrats are going to split. They're not going to be able to agree upon how to handle slavery. Northern Democrats with Stephen Douglas, they're going to sit there and say, hey, popular sovereignty, let's let the people decide. Southern Democrats like John C. Breckinridge, who's their candidate, we'll see that on the map here in just a second. He's going to say, no, any new states that come into the Union, they need to be slave. None of this popular sovereignty stuff. You've got guys like John Bell, who formed the Constitutional Union Party, and they're just like, let's not talk about slavery. Let's go ahead and just focus right here, right now, on the Constitution and upholding the Constitution. Abraham Lincoln is going to be the Republican candidate. He's going to get a narrow victory because the Democrats are divided. We talked about in class how there's 5 total votes. The 2 Democratic candidates plus John Bell, they're going to take 3 of those votes, 1 apiece, and Lincoln's going to get the remaining 2. Because the Democrat Party is divided, Lincoln is going to win the election. Lincoln in the Senate race for Illinois in 1858, this is kind of important here. He's talking with Stephen Douglas. He's talking about how he doesn't like slavery, but he's not going to come after slavery. It's going to be allowed to exist where it is. The South, because of the John Brown issue with the Harper's Ferry raid, they're not going to believe this. So when Lincoln does get elected, South Carolina, we talked about them being kind of problematic, nullification crisis, 1832, tariff of 1828. Andrew Jackson had to deal with that. They threatened to secede then. They actually do secede now, leaving the Union. They're no longer answering to the federal government. They're going to set up their own governments. They're going to be a confederacy, hence the name the Confederate States of America. That's going to operate much like our Articles of Confederation, a weaker central government that's going to be answerable to the states. The states are going to have more power. It's a little bit more independent based on the power of the states. So problems that the South's going to have are taxation, being able to raise an army, things that if you go back and check your notes for what we talked about with the Articles of Confederation, you see those problems. You're going to have the same sort of problems cropping up here. There's not enough power in the central government, the federal government in the South and the Confederate States to actually enforce decisions and make things happen that they need to happen to conduct this war they're trying to win. On the right there, you'll see Jefferson Davis. That is the president of the Confederacy. Here's the election of 1860 map. As you can see over there, Lincoln wins the popular vote, although he doesn't have a true majority. He does win the Electoral College vote, which is the one that really matters. Just to kind of recap how that works, just so you guys know. The Electoral College is each state is assigned a number of votes based on its population. You guys vote, and then you'll have, let's say that Lincoln wins 51% of Indiana. He's going to get all 13 of those votes, and every other candidate gets 0. The popular votes is 1 vote per person. They do count that directly. So in that sense, Lincoln got 40% of the vote, even though he got more than 40% of the Electoral College vote. If you guys have any questions, email me or see me about that, and we can chat a little bit more. But you can see who won what states there. Civil War's beginning. Fort Sumter, it's in South Carolina. And Lincoln has a decision. Do I resupply the fort? It's a federal fort, a northern fort. If he does this, it's probably going to cause war. It's going to be seen as an act of war. If he doesn't, the fort's going to have to probably surrender due to lack of supplies, giving it to the South. The South can't really allow Lincoln to resupply, because that's like letting the enemy come into your huddle, the enemy coming in and doing something within your country. Can't allow that. So when Lincoln decides to resupply before the ships even get there, they start attacking the fort, and the fort surrenders after just a couple days with some casualties because they just don't have the supplies to hold out. The advantages north, manufacturing, military, that's going to be important largely because they're going to be able to produce everything that you need for war: guns, weapons, bullets, clothes, you name it. Railroads, that's going to be huge for the north, a big advantage because they're going to be able to transport goods, items they've manufactured, the troops. Transportation is going to be very, very important in this war. Population, the north has almost 4 times as much population. They're going to have a lot more resources, a lot more manpower, a lot more soldiers. That's going to be big. South's going to be highly motivated. They're fighting for their homeland, their cause, slavery, states' rights, you name it. Military officers are going to offer better strategy. The South has an advantage there. And they're fighting a defensive war. They know the land, they know the territory. That's definitely an edge. The border states, you can see there on the right. West Virginia is going to come in this time as well. The border states are states that are going to stay in the Union, but they are going to be slavery states. Those are going to be important because you don't want those to leave. If they do leave, it's going to swell the South's cause, give them more troops, more supplies, more power. Plus Maryland being basically where the capital of the United States is in Washington, D.C. If Maryland were to leave, that's really, really important because then you basically put the capital of the Union in the South's hands. And that's typically speaking when a country loses its capital, it tends to kind of decapitate the government. The government's not able to function very well. 14th Amendment, we talked about this briefly. We kind of jumped ahead here. Equal protection under the law. Basically, if you are a citizen, whether you are born here or naturalized, meaning you take a test and you become a citizen, even if you were born somewhere else, you get all the rights of a citizen and you are protected under the law with those rights. Highlighting it, the Anaconda Plan real quick. We'll do the strategy and battles first. You can see up in the right-hand corner, let's blockade the South. Naval blockade, ships out there to make sure no ships are coming in and out of the South to give them supplies or to sell things and do business. They're going to cut the South in relative half, so to speak, in air quotes, down the Mississippi. Take control of that. You'll split the South in half. You'll cut them off from the outside. No supplies in and out. Communication will be much harder, and you'll kind of starve the South out. Battle of Antietam, it's in Maryland, it's Union victory. It's the nastiest, bloodiest single day of the war. There are other battles like Gettysburg where 50,000 plus people die. However, Antietam is the nastiest single day battle because that's the most that die in one day. Importance of Antietam is he sits there and says, hey, this is a big victory for us, and he needed that so he could get support for the Emancipation Proclamation, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Some of the crazy things that happen during this war, just a little bit. The draft is going to happen. People are going to basically be assigned a number, and if their number gets called, they are now in the draft. Congratulations, you're in the military. That's going to cause riots. People aren't going to generally like that after a little while. But the Union and the Confederacy, they both need the manpower to fight the war. Habeas corpus, we talked about that. You have to know the charges against you. You've got to be able to have a trial. You can't be held in prison forever and ever. Lincoln suspends that, which means he can now throw people in prison for however long he wants for really no reason. What he uses this for is you have, say, a person in Maryland who is saying, hey, the South's great, we should all secede and join the South. That's within their First Amendment rights, protection of free speech, but in the case of war here, Lincoln figures if that does happen and he gets enough, and that person gets enough people to support that, then that's a problem. You could have states seceding, and that's going to hurt the war cause. So he suspends habeas corpus so he can throw people like that in prison without really any cause other than that. Emancipation Proclamation, we talked about this a little bit today in class. Lincoln only frees the slaves in slave states that are fighting against the Union. If you are a slave state that stayed in the Union, you are not freeing your slaves. You do not have to. Why does he do this? He doesn't want the slave states that are still in the Union to be upset that he's freed their slaves and they've lost that, and then go join the South. That would be very bad for the North. He also issues this, in part, to keep foreign powers, such as Great Britain, out of the war. Great Britain was kind of sympathetic to the cause of the South. They relied on Southern cotton for textiles, clothing, blankets, all that sort of stuff. And they were considering getting in on behalf of the South to help them out. Lincoln makes this about slavery in this sense, and that keeps Britain out because Britain had previously freed all of their slaves, and slavery is illegal. It's frowned upon. So by making the war about slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation in this sense, it keeps Britain out because it would be very hypocritical of Britain to join a war and support a cause that's based around slavery. Battles, check them out in the textbook. Feel free, look all those battles up there. A lot of good information in the textbook. Union victories, Vicksburg's important. Controls the Mississippi River, splits the South in half, and effectively makes the Anaconda Plan a success. Gettysburg, a lot of casualties over several days, 50,000 plus. It's a turning point in the North. The South is going to be stretched super, super thin for supplies, troops. They were already stretched thin as it was, but it's now worse. They're not going to be able to go on the offensive hardly at all throughout the rest of the war, and it's now truly a defensive battle, and really only a matter of time before the South loses. Sherman, General Sherman, he goes marching to the sea, going through Georgia. He's got this huge path of destruction. He's tearing up railroad ties, burning crops, tearing down barns. His idea, the goal here, attacking these civilian targets, which are typically off limits in war. It's typically only military targets, but now he's doing both. The goal of this is if the North can't have it, like they're going to take anything they want and can have with them to use, but if they can't, they don't want to leave it for the South. So the goal here is to burn out, starve out, and basically just make the war so unbearable that the South surrenders. Robert E. Lee, the guy on the right there, the older looking dude. Best general in the war, he turned down a commission from the Union. Lincoln initially offers him command of the Union Army, and he says, no, I'm not really a fan of slavery, but I can't do that. He's from Virginia, and his major reason is he feels like he has to fight with Virginians. He can't turn his back on them. Grant, he's not the initial leader of the Army of the Potomac, the Union Army, but he gets bumped over there from the western side of the war after he's proven to be a winner. And he's like, hey, look, I've got more men. I'm going to keep throwing men at the enemy until we win. That's going to result in a high loss of life and make him somewhat unpopular, but Lincoln's like, hey, this guy's a winner. I've got to have him. So Grant is going to then be his main general. Big problem earlier in the war was that generals not named Grant, generally speaking, didn't do that. They let the South live to fight another day. All right, war is now pretty much over. Appomattox Courthouse, which is in Virginia. The Confederates, Robert E. Lee and General Grant, are going to meet. Cost of the war, when it's all said and done, apart from damage to having to rebuild cities and railroads and all that sort of stuff, 600,000+ soldiers are dead. Other citizens, slaves. That's not good. That's a huge cost. All told, when you count up the civilians, slaves, etc., you're talking 750,000 people, up to 1 million people killed in this war. 13th Amendment is passed, obviously, before the 14th Amendment, which we already talked about. 13th Amendment is going to end slavery permanently, with the one exception that if you've committed a crime and basically you go to prison, then they can go ahead and have you work on like a work detail, going out the side of the road, picking up trash, mowing the yards around the prison, you name it. So that is the Civil War and the recap leading up from 1852 and through the Civil War in a nutshell. Hope this helps some of you guys. If you guys have any questions, feel free to email me, stop in tomorrow morning or between classes and get a hold of me, and we'll talk out whatever we got. Best of luck on the quiz, guys.